And I'm very happy, thank you to the Zorion Institute and to our other hosts. I'm very happy to experience your legendary hospitality. What I will try to do today very quickly is to focus only on three basic questions, because we have a brief time. And the first is really back to this question of what is transitional justice, which requires also knowing what is it not. So what is it, but what is it not? Then secondly, why? Why should a country do it? And this, I think, in Armenia will be a big question. And thirdly, then, I will discuss, does it work? And there I will try to come also to some of the more specific questions here of socio-economic violations and corruption. Does transitional justice work for those kinds of questions? So first, maybe a word on what is it. And as was mentioned, I worked in Libya after the Arab Spring revolutions. And one can imagine in that region, people had many questions about this subject. And also, a problem was that the term transitional justice, it doesn't translate neatly in many languages. And in Arabic, in fact, the word for transitional comes very close to the word for selective. So people thought, it's a politicized justice. So they were saying also it's extraordinary justice, it's special. We don't need this. What we need actually is a rule of law. So they were rejecting the term, but I would actually argue that there is an agreed definition of transitional justice, even though there's also a lot of confusion. And I think through the experience of many countries, we've come to a definition of the term that really centers on this concept of addressing legacies of human rights violations. So it's addressing system problems of violations, as was mentioned by the Deputy Prime Minister. And you can do this through a variety of mechanisms. So you can choose judicial or non-judicial mechanisms, and usually you would build an approach using several of these mechanisms. But in the process, you try to all the time find the appropriate balance for your society between accountability on the one hand, about which there are clearly also international legal standards, but also reconciliation, a word which hasn't been mentioned much yet, but which every society grapples with, in fact. And to do that, the word transitional, therefore, it doesn't refer to the quality of the justice. It's not some kind of second-rate, soft justice, or that's an impression people sometimes have. It refers more to a window of opportunity that countries have when they are in political motion. So all of a sudden, change is possible. This is what a transition is. And in that window of opportunity, more may be possible than previous. Having said that, also, I do believe it's global. Already, Professor Shebas gave us a wonderful overview of all the origins. But everywhere where I've been in recent years, people are grappling with this issue to some extent or another. Of course, in the Middle East, very recently, big questions. But even in other societies, Canada had a truth commission for the First Nations and for the fact that many children were kidnapped from First Nations or from the indigenous people. You know, Australia, there are many countries dealing with parts of their history which sit uncomfortably and which need addressing in order to move forward. And in that sense, you really need to be context-specific. Every country needs its own tailored approach. And I can't stress this enough. The international experiences, they should never serve to dictate what you should do. They could only serve to, in a sense, inspire and to spark creativity. And lastly, in terms of what it is or what it is not, I think the how is more important than the what. And this was alluded to also earlier, the process of how you do it, the process of national dialogue and consultation, and involving the victims. This is what leads to the more transformative aspects of transitional justice. And essentially, transitional justice should try to seek transformation. This then comes to the question of why. In many countries, people will legitimately ask, do we need to go back to the past? It's either painful or it could cause further conflict. It's disruptive. Shouldn't we be forward-looking? But to my mind, exactly transitional justice's strongest rationale for it is in fact forward-looking. So it should never be about revenge. It should really be about an eye to the future and forging that new future based in fact on a new covenant. And this is where this concept of the social contract comes in. Many people have written about this. If you had the chance to read any of the work of the former rapporteur for transitional justice for the United Nations system, he's written quite a lot on civic trust and the importance of rebuilding civic trust in post-conflict or post-authoritarian context. So, in fact, as it was said by the philosopher Santayana, who's a Spanish philosopher, he said, "Those who do not remember the past are condemned to repeat it." So this issue of non-repetition and prevention of further violations, I think, is really at the core and the root of transitional justice, and therefore it does justify looking at a past, no matter how troubled, in order to know what to do in the future. And together with that, and this was also already alluded to, transitional justice gives us problems of scale. And this is really also why it's difficult to use the ordinary justice system, is because numerically there are too many violations. There are too many victims, too many perpetrators. And this means that we need to find new approaches. So this has a technical dimension. But I should say it's technical, but it should not be mechanical. Sometimes in recent years, because transitional justice has existed 25 years, you have, of course, people who travel the world, who give advice. It's become almost a matter of checklist approach, but it should never be that. Avoid the checklist approach. It's technical, but not mechanical. And it is political, but it's not politicized. So it should always be based on standards which cannot be derived from political bias. But of course, transitional justice takes place in a political context. So what do we know about whether it actually works? And here I want to come to a difficult question which has received much debate in transitional justice circles, because for now I will venture to say that in the case of civil and political rights, the kind of rights for which we saw, the experiences either in Eastern Europe or in Latin America, where there were widespread disappearances and even the creation of victim groups such as mothers or grandmothers of the disappeared. Also South Africa, if you think of some of the terrible violations that took part under apartheid. So we know quite a bit about how transitional justice works for addressing human rights violations. And there's quite some, I would say, consensus that this is necessary. And that consensus, you can find it in a whole variety of also international conventions, human rights standards, even the creation of the International Criminal Court. So in general, there is perhaps more acceptance that it's important to address human rights violations internationally than there is on the socio-economic front. And there has, conversely, been quite a lot of discussion about whether it's actually appropriate to use transitional justice for corruption or for socio-economic violations. And here you can think of even South Africa. I was reading a very, very interesting article yesterday in Foreign Affairs. It's an issue they published last year, but it's all about the past and how countries dealt with their painful past. In South Africa, apparently, after the transition, the ANC kind of departed from its leftist roots. And it ended up doing quite some bargaining with the big business, because it also felt that it needed to enter, in a sense, the world of capitalism and play with the big boys in order to keep South Africa on the map as a viable economic power. And they did play with the big boys, and as a result, several issues which were discussed kind of during the TRC era, including having, for instance, a wealth tax on wealthy South Africans, which of course tended to be predominantly white. A lot of those ideas went out the window. And in fact, it's only this year where they've had a quite innovative process. It's called a People's Tribunal. And this People's Tribunal in South Africa now is looking at issues of corruption. and of state capture, and of arms trading. And you may say corruption, maybe it's necessary because they had Zuma, and we all know he was involved in large-scale corruption. But some of the conclusions of this process were that the corruption really happened much earlier, and that it was, in fact, already part of that post-transition period, which, you know, Nelson Mandela was ahead. You can't get more political good faith than that. But the South African process didn't address the very fundamental socio-economic inequalities that were part of South African society, and that remain a problem today. And in fact, scholar Mahmoud Mamdani has written very famously on how transitional justice in South Africa never addressed who benefits from apartheid. What were the systems that benefited, and what was their accountability? And so, really, I think in transitional justice, we should be thinking more about ways to address structural issues in our society, ways to implement institutional reforms that really go to these questions of systemic inequalities or systemic legacies of violations, and these can include socio and economic violations, I do believe. That brings me, of course, to a very brief discussion of the transitions in the Middle East, because I think there are a couple of lessons that are valuable. Of course, those transitions were very much motivated by the fight against corruption. One can think of Tunisia, the young man who set himself on fire. He was, in fact, just a fruit seller, but he was being harassed by the police every day to pay bribes. So one day he got so fed up, he went to the government building to file a complaint, and they didn't even allow him in the building because he said he's not of the right class to enter, etc. He got so desperate he set himself on fire. So at the root of those, and at least in Egypt and in Tunisia, at the root of those uprisings or revolutions were socioeconomic equality issues. So one can ask now, 7 or 8 years later, how have they done? And in Tunisia, in fact, they had, of course, in the first instance, 2 commissions of inquiry. One looked at corruption and one looked at human rights violations. They made good findings, but they had to go one step further. And the Truth and Dignity Commission in Tunisia is also looking at corruption issues, but had the mandate to pass those for prosecution to specialized chambers. And those specialized chambers have not been set up. And of course, what's happened in Tunisia, and also to some extent dramatically in Egypt, in fact, is that some of the gains of the revolutions have been reversed. Because gradually, and in Tunisia also, there was a kind of a deal, I would say, between the elites and business people in order to say, let's be very forward-looking in this country. Yes, we have a Truth Commission, and yes, we'll look at civil and political violations, including deaths that happened during the revolutions. But let's also keep the economy moving forward. Let's invest in development. And in Tunisia now, recently, they've tabled what they call an economic reconciliation bill. And so there would, in fact, be amnesties for corruption. But it is possible to think of interesting formula, I think, to play with amnesties for corruption, because indeed, if people are willing to return the money, there is no prohibition, certainly, on amnesties for economic crimes internationally. So this is something interesting to think about. Another issue that was very, very dominant in the Arab Spring transitions was vetting. So basically, there was the idea in Tunisia, but also in Libya, for instance, that people who had been part of the Gaddafi regime should not have any place in the new political order, so they should be excluded from any kind of public service. Now, in Libya, this idea, unfortunately, they took it one step further, and they, in fact, what they called it is they called it political isolation. So they passed a law on political isolation, but the big problem with it was that it was not based on individual conduct. So instead of looking at the conduct of a person and whether they were involved in human rights abuses or corruption, instead of that, they were looking purely at political affiliation. And had you been part of a revolutionary committee under the Gaddafi regime, or had you in any way propagated the Green Book, etc. So in the end, they ended up trying to expel large numbers of public servants from their positions. And this has led to incredible backlash, as you can imagine. And part of the chaos that persists in Libya today is in fact because of that political isolation law. And so I think the main lesson there is really that if you are to do any kind of vetting, it must be based on individual conduct, and it must also take place in a way that respects the due process rights of the people involved. Because after all, transitional justice, if it is to rebuild the social contract and to reaffirm the rule of law, then it should take place in a way that respects the rule of law. And that sounds very, very simple, but it's very difficult in practice. And so I think there is a lot of food for thought about how exactly you do that. Having said that, I think there is also a chance to innovate. Professor Shedis already said that. But I don't think that just because Armenia is a unique case, and I will finish with this, I don't think that means, oh, it's not a question of does transitional justice apply or not. It's more a question of how do you make transitional justice work for you? And what is necessary to build a process that fits for Armenia. And in these issues of vetting, for instance, what you can think about is positive incentive structures. For instance, the judiciary in South Africa, one thing they did do quite often is to encourage judges to take early retirement. And to say you do that in your full honor, etc., but you're just not going to the bench anymore. We don't want to see you in court, but you have, this option. In Libya, we discussed also those options, but yeah, they weren't unfortunately implemented. So, in general, a study on Eastern Europe and on the vetting mechanisms there showed that there was more success in uncovering truth with systems that used incentives than with systems that used only pure investigation. So this is, I think, a very interesting issue. I do think at all times it's extremely necessary to keep this issue of public consultation and national dialogue at the heart of what you do, and to have people-centered approaches to this issue which have public support. The role of civil society and the media is extremely important. In fact, I would go so far as to say that there is no country that succeeded in transitional justice which didn't have a strong media and civil society input. They were always the drivers of the process, and that needs to be the same, I think, here. But having said that, yeah, I think there's a chance to innovate and to show political leadership and even to accept the challenge to undertake this more challenging issue of long-term institutional reform.